Dragon's Dogma 2 is shaping up to be perhaps the best RPG of 2024, with some already claiming it as the game of the year. There's a lot of hype around it, so in this video, we'll be going over the essential basics of what the game is, what it's about, what the gameplay and exploration are like, and much more. Additionally, I am giving away 2 free copies of Dragon's Dogma 2. Just leave a comment down below what part of Dragon's Dogma 2 you're most interested in doing for a chance to win. And if you want another chance, follow my Twitter/X account, linked in the video description down below, for another Dragon's Dogma 2 giveaway that will be announced there as well. And definitely hit that subscribe button for more Dragon's Dogma 2 lore, gameplay, and live streams if you're interested in the game. Just to get a couple of details out of the way in regards to the technicalities of Dragon's Dogma 2, while the release date was advertised as March 22nd, it'll be first available on the 21st in the late evening for most of North and South America, with the earliest time at 8 PM US Eastern on PC through the Steam platform. PS5 and Xbox players will be able to play at the stroke of midnight on March 22nd in those regions, while others are listed as seen in the video. Minimum specs to run it if you're on PC is an i5-10600 or a Ryzen 5 3600 CPU with 16GB RAM. For GPU, a NVIDIA 1070 or AMD Radeon RX 5500 XT with 8GB VRAM, while the recommended specs are an i7-10700 or AMD Ryzen 5 3600X CPU with 16GB RAM, while for GPUs, a NVIDIA 2080 or AMD Radeon RX 6700. Of importance is that you do not have to have played the first Dragon's Dogma to understand what you're jumping into, as this sequel is essentially a parallel world of the first game. A lot of you are lore lovers, but without giving spoilers, I will say the story of Dragon's Dogma 2 is that you are an Arisen, an individual who's had their heart literally stolen by a dragon. Your grand quest is to hunt down and slay that dragon, which has its own implications you'll need to ponder on. Along the way, you're going to get involved in a lot of lives and plots, as Dragon's Dogma 2, which has 4 times the map size of the prequel, takes place in the lands of Battahl, Vermund, and the Sacred Arbor. Battahl is the home of the Beastren, while the Sacred Arbor is the homeland of the Elves, whereas the Kingdom of Vermund is the Kingdom of Humans. These 3 entities may politically pull at us Arisen, as we are an important figure for their own causes and interests. Stories along the journey, whether it's to do with everyday folk or hidden secrets like the Sphinx, will also glean more lore on the world of Dragon's Dogma 2. Additionally, there may be a contagious disease-like condition called the Dragon's Plague you may need to keep an eye on as you travel with your companions. The character creation for Dragon's Dogma 2 is great. There's nothing much more to say about that if you've looked at the various community creations that came about from the Dragon's Dogma 2 character creation demo. You can choose to be an elf, human, or beastren. While the body types and such offered seem basic at first, a lot of people will definitely have fun with this character creator, considering it can be very detailed. Unlike in other games where your class, traits, or background determines what your character is, Dragon's Dogma 2's vocations are meant to be tools to choose and use for different scenarios or gameplay. It is in fact encouraged for you to go through multiple vocations and try different things out in terms of both the gameplay and stat building. There are 10 total vocations or classes in Dragon's Dogma 2 you can experiment around with. The fighter vocation excels in melee combat. You can wield a sword and shield. Fighters can slice through enemy ranks and deliver powerful blows while also using their shields to protect themselves and their allies. The archer vocation is, well, the archer. You can have a great position shooting at enemies from afar. And then you have the thief, which is basically your rogue archetype, and you can deal rapid and consecutive strikes with the thief, while also being, I believe, the only vocation where you can actually evade enemy attacks with an actual dodge. And of course, you have the mage and the sorcerer. These vocations are based on advanced and powerful magics, where the longer the incantation, the better the skills or spells are, which definitely incentivizes your positioning during fights. Then you have the warrior, which in contrast to the fighter doesn't have a shield, but are basically masters of two-handed weapons, such as the great sword and the hammer. And of course, we do have 4 additional vocations that are considered hybrid or advanced that can only be used by the player characters, such as the magic archer, which focuses on AoE damage and also supporting your party with magical arrows. We had the mystic spear hand, which looks like honestly a Jedi master going around and beating on things. You also have unique weapons to these classes, whether it's a dual spear or the magic bow and arrows. We also have the trickster, which is basically an illusionist, and you can also not only deceive enemies with illusions, but you can also buff your party members' fighting strength. And of course, last but not least, is the warfarer, which which is essentially a vocation that allows you as the player to use every weapon and learn different skills from each vocation. And by using all these weapons, you can respond to basically any situation that arises during a fight, and also create different combinations of movesets that will kind of dip into different vocations. That's really cool. However, there's of course downsides to each of these vocations, or advantages as well, depending on the fight or scenario you find yourself in while you play Dragon's Dogma 2. In addition to this, vocations grant you movesets or core movesets and passive stats or other advantages. For example, the double-ended spear or dual spear being better to use against larger enemies like dragons. You can encounter NPCs as well called vocation masters to unlock even more skills per vocation, so that there's something more to pursue once you've kind of learned or gained all the basic skills through your vocation. Of course, we also have to talk about the pawns, which are part of the in-game lore, though gameplay-wise, they will also be immensely helpful to players depending on their vocations and traits. Pawns are basically your companions. You can recruit for your party up to a maximum of 3 pawns, and before you think of repetitive dialogue or useless AI, the director of Dragon's Dogma 2, Hideaki Itsuno, has said his team has tried to make pawn dialogue as unique as possible, while making the pawns offer incentives for the players to actually care about them. Party composition for combat will of course matter. Maybe you'll have 2 frontline pawns if you're an archer or sorcerer, or you have an archer pawn if you're at the front lines of combat as a fighter or warrior. Theory crafting is pretty healthy in this area for a single player RPG, very surprisingly. What's also unique about the pawns is that the pawns you can acquire are pawns from other players. In fact, the pawn you make will also be used by other players, though your pawn will always accompany your character alongside 2 other pawns you choose through the player network, which I think is really cool. The amount of experience and knowledge your pawns accumulate throughout your journey will actually matter, and these pawns will help you or point things out if they've been there before with another player, and so on, which will help immensely in discovering a lot of content in Dragon's Dogma 2. Pawns will also have specializations in addition to their vocations. One of the many specializations a pawn can have is the ability, for example, to translate Elvish. So if you run into an elf NPC that can only speak Elvish, which by the way was an entire language constructed by the game's developers for the game, and you have a pawn that specializes in translating Elvish, that pawn can be your interpreter. And if you don't have that pawn, well, you're gonna have to figure something out. What's really interesting as well is that you can cultivate both the personalities and relationships of these pawns and other NPCs through basically relationship exchanges. It's pretty cool that if you mistreat, for example, the friend of an NPC, the other NPC won't just stand there with a blank stare, but will react to that mistreatment, much like Baldur's Gate 3 and other RPGs have done. NPCs in the world, from merchants to guards, will always move about their daily lives, regardless of what you're doing in the world, which really adds to the immersive quality of the game. And oftentimes you may be approached by a lot of NPCs asking for favors or giving you quests instead of you hunting down every single NPC or quest giver to do objectives or check out the landmark. Before we get into the combat, gameplay, or even the exploration, Dragon's Dogma 2 is not a game for everyone. The developers have their vision for this game, whether you'll like it or not. Dragon's Dogma 2 can be described as bold in terms of the concepts. Everything that will be encountered or seen as lacking on a subjective level by a lot of gamers was purposely done. The game is intended to not hold your hand too much. It's also not meant to be explored in chunks like the open world Assassin's Creed games. They'll try to be seamless and immersive as possible, with attempts at making loading screens non-existent or at least not so obvious. Things like fast travel are hard to access, and the game emphasizes making usage of the in-game systems like pawns or switching up your vocations. There are mechanics and punishing mechanics. There's only one save slot to prevent save scumming, which again may not bide well with a lot of people, like the aforementioned traits of Dragon's Dogma 2. In terms of combat, it's fluid, with the ability to not just climb monsters you fight, but also to stand on them and use your skills. You can even grapple monsters to push or pull them. You have finishing blows on low health enemies and mechanics to be aware of, or be aware of vocation advantages which may need to be figured out for certain enemies or fights. And as said before, vocations can affect a lot of combat gameplay, so approaches to the same monsters or same fights can differ highly depending on what vocation you are utilizing for your character at the time, in conjunction with the composition of your party, depending on what kind of pawns you have with you. If we have to sum up the game's exploration aspect, it's definitely about the journey and not the destination. It can take up to an hour just to travel on foot to certain landmarks or cities. days, and while you do these painstaking travels, the day and night cycle in the world of Dragon's Dogma 2 will also continue, with nighttime being an incredibly dangerous time for you and your pawns, with certain creatures spawning in. You can set up camp at campfire locations to regroup with your party, although repeatedly using the same campsite may not be advisable due to certain creatures. No matter how you travel, whether it's on foot or by ox carts, you do run the risk of getting ambushed on the road by different monsters or even other adventurers. While fast travel is available via fairy stones, it can be expensive, and the game pushes you to make the hard decisions in determining where you go, your adventuring logistics, and so on. For instance, your max health won't recover its original value if you take a lot of damage, which voids the usage of health potions, for example, and necessitating using towns to replenish your max health. The amount of resources or kits you can carry will have weight, which not only just slows you down as you travel, but penalizes movement during combat, so you can't just stack 8 instances of camping provisions in your inventory to continuously explore with any consequences. You have to think about it. Environmental awareness is encouraged in terms of exploration and combat. Various terrain and environmental structures can be broken or changed. Dams can be broken, for example, to unleash floods during fights to kill creatures. Lastly, while there is a decent amount of housing in Dragon's Dogma 2 for your character to purchase after much exploring, customization doesn't seem like it'll be a big thing as far as housing or placing of furnishings go. And that's the essential basics of Dragon's Dogma 2, and if you want more Dragon's Dogma 2 content, including guides, tips, lore, and more, again, definitely hit that subscribe button, and I hope to see your pawns out there.